Good morning. I'm Richard Lawson, Dean of the Cathedral, and it's a joy to welcome Dr. Adam Gregerman to the Dean's Forum and all of you who are joining us in person and everyone who's joining us online. We're glad that you're here, and this, of course, is the kickoff Sunday for the Dean's Forum. They will continue throughout fall and spring, and without going into great detail, starting today, we have a great round of speakers and topics, especially for this fall. Our guest this morning is the Everding lecturer, Dr. Adam Gregerman. Welcome, Adam. I want to say just a little bit about the annual Everding lecture. There was a beloved member of St. John's Cathedral whose husband was also a professor of New Testament at Iliff School of Theology, Lee Everding. She died a couple of years ago. We just love Lee. Lee, many years ago, funded an annual lecture series that's an interfaith series. And so what we do is we have a speaker here at the cathedral, and then that speaker does a lecture or two at Iliff School of Theology. At the end of today, we'll let people know about your lecture tomorrow night. This year's speaker is Dr. Gregerman. He is the professor of Jewish Studies in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies and associate director of the Institute for Jewish Catholic Relations at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. He teaches many different types of courses, one of which is on the Jewishness of Jesus, and we'll spend a great deal of time on that. He also focuses on Jewish-Christian relations, and we'll talk a good deal about that, especially in relation to the Episcopal Church. He's the author of Building on the Ruins of the Temple, Apologetics and Polemics in Early Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism. Among his other publications are recent chapters in the Cambridge Companion to Law and the Hebrew Bible, along with publications in a range of other reputable journals. He is fluent in conversations about theodicy, biblical interpretation, and theologies of the land of Israel. And we'll get into that a little bit too. Above all, Adam, welcome.
Thank you. Is this on? Is it loud enough? Okay, great.
Yeah, welcome. We are so glad that you are here, and I hope travels and everything went well for you.
Yeah, it was great. If I could say, I'm glad to be here too. We had planned for this event a while ago, and I had a family loss that led us to put it off. But it's a treat because you and I got to study together
Yes.
for the last visit. We studied some Psalms, we studied some topics, and then that visit got put off. And then we got to study together again,
Yes.
which had also been quite a nice experience. So Reverend Lawson and I have been talking with each other for a while now. So I appreciate the chance to be with you in person. Thank you also for coming.
Well, I'm delighted. Let's just dive right in. So the Jewishness of Jesus is something that's just, it's as obvious as a water is to fish, but we miss it. And we being many fundamentalist Christians miss it, but even thoughtful Episcopalians miss it too. This is obviously something you are interested in. You've got a course that you teach every now and then on it. Tell us about the course, and then we'll dive in.
It's, just to be clear, it's part of a course I teach on Jewish-Christian relations that also includes comparative theology. And one of the topics that's a bridge of sorts between Jewish and Christian traditions in the present period, but in many ways a source of some division or discomfort, to be more precise, an effort to sort of downplay Jesus' Jewishness. Is something that we sort of wrestle with when we think about how Jesus' Jewishness has been perceived in history, starting with the first century, moving through time, and then really only in the last half century or so has this been seen as a topic that's productive for Jews and Christians, especially in dialogue with each other. And so while Jesus' Jewishness doesn't change, what people think about it changes. You know?
And this certainly would be, we should say, there's a there's always a relationship between theology and history, or theology and culture, and there's a kind of push-pull. So think about, say, in World War I or II, the question of theodicy and the use of force is going to be just gigantic, right? Because of what's going on in the world with the biblical attitude towards peace. Of course, Holocaust onward, there is the question of the Jewishness of Jesus is not sort of on the periphery. It is urgent and it's an emergency, right? So that's a part of the background.
Yeah, and I think in particular, and this, by the way, is true for really Jewish-Christian relations in general, nearly everything that we think of, certainly in a positive sense, goes back to the wake of the Holocaust, and particularly to the 1960s, when the Catholic Church and other churches made this dramatic shift. A good way to think about just how dramatic a difference there is between, say, the 1930s and 1940s, and in the period thereafter, though it takes a while, is that during the Second World War, during the Nazi age, there was an entire academic institute devoted to the de-Judaization of Jesus in Germany. And it was, I say an academic institute. I put that academic in quotes because it's really above all a political project. But it was, how do I say this? It was an effort to minimize Jesus' Jewishness in the most extreme sense, but one could probably argue difference in degree but not kind from what came before. Meaning Jesus' Jewishness has always been a source of some awkwardness and confusion, and this goes back really to even the 2nd century. The most pernicious use of the sort of separation of Jesus from Judaism occurs obviously in this example from Germany in the 30s and the 40s, but there's long been a sense of discomfort of sort of what do we do with that? And that's true at a very early age, right? Because you sort of imagine the earliest Christians, or Christians isn't even the right word, the earliest followers of Jesus are themselves Jews. And they are, from the book of Acts, for example, in no way estranged from their Jewishness. That is, what do they do when Jesus is resurrected, seen, visits, and ascends, whatever? They go to the temple in Jerusalem, and that's where they keep going. And so the earliest followers have no sense of separation from Judaism. With the influx, however, of Gentiles into what was originally an all-Jewish movement, you start to have this perception that the Jewishness of Jesus is unimportant. That is, it's not especially relevant because the presentation of Jesus as a teacher of Torah who spends his time arguing with other Jews about how to observe the Sabbath isn't that relevant to a Gentile community in Corinth or in Athens. I think it would be fair to say that there is no polemical point being made when Paul says, don't get circumcised to Gentile believers. That is an anti-Jewish claim being made. Rather, Paul is talking to non-Jews with his understanding of what it means to be approaching the eschaton. And so scholars increasingly read Paul as directed not at Judaism, but at Gentile believers entering these churches, and therefore the message he preaches is one that has little to do with the historical Jesus. As time will go on, and this is certainly going to be true, in practically sort of every Orthodox church, I use Orthodox with sort of lowercase o, the creeds start with Jesus' birth, and then they say, I'm guessing you all know this better than I do, but something like, born to Mary, died under Pontius Pilate. And everything in the middle gets dropped out. You would think it was irrelevant. Now, ironically, the Gospels thought it was relevant, but later Christians didn't think that was particularly relevant. Even more so, however, it's a source of some sense of awkwardness and maybe confusion. One example, second century writer Justin Martyr says, Jesus was circumcised. I mean, that's not surprising, but it's hard to know what to do with that. And so as an example, there's an effort made in this second century Gentile Christian document to try to somehow recognize Jesus' Jewishness. That is not deny it, but at the same time use it to make a point about, for example, the abrogation of law observance for a Gentile church. And so this trend will continue over time, and then, at the 4th century and 5th century, these creeds that largely downplay Jesus' Jewishness. And I think that's probably uniform for most of history, exceptions maybe perhaps the Puritans or whoever, but that de-Judaization of Jesus, and in this case I don't want to be recalling Nazi theology, I just want to say in a more benign sense, is something that is prominent in much of Christian history, and by the way, not all nefarious. In some sense, the creeds are not anti-Jewish; they just drop it because it's irrelevant. Is there something else going on there? I'm not sure, but it's something to kind of consider, not necessarily in a polemical way or nefarious way.
Yeah. So this is really good. So let's kind of just I'm going to summarize just a little bit about what Dr. Gregerman said, and then look at some of the content of Jesus' teachings. Sure. And frame it within Absolutely. Judaism. So if you want to look this up later, again, it is just remarkable. It's mind-blowing to us in so many ways who are gathering at a Christian Episcopal church this morning to say our prayers. But at the end of the book of Luke, and the same author of Luke is the author of the book of Acts, at the end of the book of Luke, after the resurrection, the apostles and the followers of Jesus go to the temple to worship. I mean, so it's just I mean, we can't even. And then what some scholars believe, and let's do just a quick riff on this. This is what I was taught in seminary, and a lot of what I was taught in seminary, I either A, misunderstood, or B, has been revised. So please feel free to do the latter.
I won't be correcting you. I'll be correcting your professors.
Exactly. But what I was taught in seminary, I remember it. And we had a wonderful New Testament professor, and there's a phrase in John's Gospel where there's this sort of meditation on the future, and there's this phrase where the followers of Jesus, and the phrase is "apos synagogos," that they will be removed, kicked out of the synagogue. Yeah. And what I was taught, that means that John's Gospel had to be really late, much later than Matthew, Mark, or Luke, because they can date, and I'm doing this way from memory, somewhere in the 60s in the 1st century, that the Christians they either removed themselves or were kicked out. The division between Jews and Christians had become so great that the Christians couldn't go into the synagogue for all kinds of reasons. And so it was, on the one hand, a way of dating that gospel as being after that fact, and on another hand, of just showing that John's gospel, and that's why John's gospel gets so polemical. What's your take on that?
Yeah.
What grade do I get on that little?
So, the only thing I would say a B+, if only because.
Oh, that's great. So if anybody's like, that was a little low from Richard, no, we'll take that.
And only because I would just correct one thing, which is that it's probably much later. That is, it's probably around the year 100, which, I sound like we're like very picayune here. But the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in a war with Rome probably inaugurates some of these, how do I say, the upheavals in various Jewish communities. And so what probably happens, and this is pretty widely accepted, is why is John so polemical against, and the term he uses is the Jews, which, by the way, is hard for, I think, us to grasp how weird that is. That would be like me saying to you, by the way, I don't know what it is about the Americans. Why don't they, and then fill it in. It's like, well, you can probably tell from my accent, right? I'm an American too. And so the notion of sort of putting myself outside that is a very dramatic statement. Now, the term that you're focusing on, and in many ways this is one of the linchpins of contemporary scholarship, is that that various folks in the story of the gospel, John, are worried that if they confess something about Jesus, they will be aposynagogo, which is a term that's used 3 times in the Gospel of John. And it means something like kicked out of the synagogue. And what that's helped scholars to understand is that the context within which that gospel is being written is probably a time of great upheaval around maybe the year 100, that is in the wake of the destruction of the temple, in a war with Rome in 70. John's community is trying to find its footing, as are many other Jewish groups, and it is highly unlikely that anybody's kicking anybody out of synagogues for what they said about Jesus in the year 30. But it is far more likely that the types of claims being made about Jesus that explicitly provoke Jewish negative responses in John are the types of things that would get you kicked out of a synagogue in the year 100. Most famously statements like, the Father and I are one, right? Which is seen, we don't have to infer that that was problematic to the Jews who heard it. John actually tells us it was. John says, and they all the more wanted to kill him because he made that statement and his followers were being shunned. And so we have some sense that the separation is taking place for the reasons that you described, and it helps us learn not as much about the year 30, but a whole lot about the year 100, because it's an effort by John to in some way make sense of his community's experience, just like happens in Matthew, in the sense that they're making sense of their community's experience, probably in 80 or 90. And so, that's the setting in which that emerges.
Well, let's look at some of the content of Jesus' teaching under this rubric. So I would love to hear you say a little bit about, well, think about, for us, when you come to church, and especially in an Episcopal church, the whole notion of interpretation is something that we just revel in. What's the preacher going to say? How did Jesus interpret things? And then all the space that comes from that and how we interpret things. Jesus, it seems like a rabbi, so I would love for you to say a little bit about that. Yeah. And then the second thing is Jesus talks a lot about God, and that seems pretty Jewish too.
Right, yeah.
Thanks for the little laugh there.
No, you're maybe still smarting from the B+. If my students come complain, I'm often persuaded enough to maybe make it an A-.
Actually, that's so funny. You know what my B+, that is hilarious. It just came back to me. My only B+ in seminary was Dr. Richard Corney, God bless his soul, Hebrew scholar. And I got a B+ in Old Testament 1, and it was an 89.3.
And so I have to say that bothers me, because one of the things that Bible scholars try to do is challenge this idea of the Old Testament God as a God of wrath. And I feel like saying, yeah, show a little mercy.
Amen.
That's there too.
Dr. Corney did not. Okay, Jesus is rabbi, is interpreter.
Yeah, and so, I think one of the things that's in some way entirely obvious but often missed is that the nature of Jesus' interactions with his fellow Jews are entirely in keeping with what we know from contemporary Jewish documents that Jews argued with each other about, right? What did Jesus argue about? Yeah, he argued about Sabbath law. He argued about interaction with Rome, purity law. He argued about things like interactions with others as shaped by biblical ideas, for example, forgiveness, right? This is Jewish through and through. And let me name then one of the tensions here that has gotten some attention, which is Jesus so much looks like other Jews that it can be uncomfortable, I think, for Christians to interact with historical Jesus scholarship. And I can sort of leave it to you to think about this. But Jesus as a Jew doesn't look that different from apocalyptic first century Jews, of whom we know of a dozen, who go around preaching, resist Rome, either in word or less often in deed. But for example, the historian Josephus tells us there are lots of messianic candidates who end up murdered by Rome for their actions that are provocative, things they say. And it can be hard then to somehow sort of accommodate the notion of the Christ's uniqueness with Jesus the Jew's relationship to that. And that's, I think, an interesting tension to think about. Yeah.
As a subset of that, let's do this real quick. So think about one of the things that we love as Episcopalians, I certainly love as a preacher. I love it, and it's usually in the summer when the parables show up. So Jesus, telling a story, say there was a man who had two sons, and one of the sons, the older, in fact, was just so obedient and perfect, never left home, ran the business, and just never strayed. The younger son, on the other hand, squandered everything. And we're curious what he did, because it sounds kind of fun. And so on. And all these parables. There was a woman who lost a coin, and it just drove her crazy. So she went through, these, talk about parables.
Yeah. So the parables in the New Testament are, of course, often wonderful, sometimes mysterious or inscrutable. A very characteristic mode of Jesus' teaching. And we know this is true from rabbinic literature, that this is a way Jews often taught, especially because what you're sort of tapping into is metaphors from real life, right? Lost sheep, a lost coin, right? The sort of images that people have all around them. And Jesus, of course, does this with a great amount of sort of pithiness and insight. Really, they're quite fascinating, and often, interestingly, they don't tell you what you think they're going to say. The challenge is to sort of, let me put this. What Christian and Jewish scholars alike have tried to do is to preserve some sense of distinctiveness, of even uniqueness, messages that are different than we're hearing from others, without saying something like, Jesus is the only one who says things like that, with the implication that it's better. For example, Jesus often refers to God as Abba, which is Hebrew or Aramaic for father. And for decades, scholars said there's an intimacy there that other Jews don't have. Well, that's just incorrect. That term gets used all over the place in Second Temple Jewish literature. And so the challenge is to preserve some aspect of Jesus' distinctiveness without at the same time deprecating Judaism. That is, can you say one thing is good without saying something else is bad? And certainly for centuries, the argument was often, well, Jesus explains to the Pharisees something, and they're really immoral and crude and hateful or whatever. Frankly, they're just having an argument. Type of thing we see all the time in that period, obviously given a spin by Matthew, for example. But the challenge is to not have to set up a foil against which Jesus is defined as a Jew, because the temptation is to say, he's the better Jew and everyone else is a bad Jew. And people don't want to do that for obvious reasons. It's both historically problematic, but also morally. And so this is something I think really very thoughtful biblical scholars have given a lot of attention to.
And again, not to so much go back there, but where most of us are nodding. I mean, just draw. I mean, the Holocaust is not primarily the result of bad theology, but you can draw that line. You can draw that line. So it's the worst of religion, and all of us are here for the best of religion. Let's start to shift a little bit, and we're going to do Q&A at the end. We'll see how much time we have for it. We'll do Q&A at the end. But let's start to shift a little bit, and you've got some thoughts on the relationship between Judaism and the Episcopal Church.
Yeah, sure. We'd spoken some about this. So as I mentioned, the major shift in Jewish-Christian relations in general takes place in the 1960s, and above all with the Vatican, in its release of the Second Vatican Council document, Nostra Aetate, which means in our time, in Latin from the first few words of the Vatican text. And while the roots of some of this effort to not... Actually, let me come back for a second. The content I'll say something about, but you already have statements that try to, in some sense, address the Holocaust in Christian theology right after the war, through the 40s, actually less into the 50s, and then again into the 60s. by the time you get to the 1960s, the Catholic Church and other American and Western churches are engaged in this process of rethinking how to present Jews and Judaism in a way that's both, again, sort of moral and historically correct. And the Episcopal Church in particular has done a very sort of serious job in rethinking, and this is hard, right? Rethinking theology. And so what are the issues that come up? I mean, the issues that come up, for example, are, and this was most prominent in Nostra Aetate in 1665, which is rejecting the accusation that the Jews killed Jesus and that sin is passed down through generations. That claim, which has a long, long history, is rejected in the 1965 document. It's so absurd on its face that, frankly, it never shows up again in Western dialogue. But more serious are questions about, for example, in the church, the Episcopal Church, sort of, so what do we say about salvation and covenant? Traditionally, the churches, Protestant and Catholic alike, have held to a rather narrow sense of soteriology. That is, this is where, I mean, people here I'm sure know much more about sort of Episcopal theology, but the challenge has been to find a way to make room for the legitimacy of Judaism alongside Christianity, to break with a long pattern of hostility. And starting in the 1980s and continuing up to the last few years, the Episcopal Church has issued a number of sort of major statements, as has the Anglican Church, that attempt to deal with some of these issues. Covenant, mission, history, and some of them are painfully frank, to their credit. And I think that there's much to be, much to celebrate about that. You know, there's no one who's writing those statements who in any way bears any responsibility for the past. What we have are people who are trying to do the best in the present and the future, and therefore, to a Jew involved in Jewish-Christian relations, it's remarkably admirable to have an openness to those sorts of hard questions, because they're not easy.
So just a couple of quick responses to that. Think about when we use as Christians the language of New Covenant or New Testament. The problem with it is, it seems that it's superseding the old one. And just to show you from what different angle the absurdity of that, how could Christians ever think that there's going to be a new covenant that undoes the first covenant with Judaism? I mean, can you imagine, do you want a God that's going to break a covenant? I mean, that's like literally absurd and immoral and arrogant and many, many, many other things. So you just see this I don't know if the slippery slope is the right word, but we as Christians, as Episcopalians, cannot understand our own faith, literally, without an appreciation of Judaism.
Yeah, and I would, if I could, I'll read you a couple of short quotes, but the Episcopal Church released documents in 1988 and 2021, and Anglicans as well, as I said. But let me just read you an excerpt from one of them. A strong theology accounting for God's continuing covenant with the church and the Jewish people alike is the best corrective for unjust things in the past. Mm-hmm. Right? So notice that there's an affirmation here of an ongoing covenant between both communities. It's a very far-seeing statement. At the same time, to highlight the challenges that raises, and when I said the document, some of these documents are quite frank, so the same document, the Episcopalian document, says, the relationship between the two communities, Jews and Episcopalians, both worshiping the God of Israel, is a given historical fact. But how it is to be understood and explained theologically is a matter of internal discussion among Christians and Jews in dialogue. You can see that there wasn't a whole lot of clarity there, right? That's a hard thing to work out. Yeah. And what they've mostly said is there is a Christian new covenant and also a Jewish old covenant, and one doesn't cancel the other, but the relationship between the two of them is complex. And by the way, I mean, this is not a unique question for Episcopalians, right? Yeah. All religions have to ask themselves, what about them? who are outside, right? So I don't want to highlight the confusion here in this episcopal document as if they're the only ones trying to figure out the status of outsiders vis-a-vis God. It's a very, in some sense, sort of generic, I mean that in a neutral sense, generic problem for any community that draws its boundaries in a certain way.
Yeah, I mean, we've got to shift again, but just there's so much we could do with that. So I'm just give you some just quick anecdotes, just for the sake of the imagination. These are fast. I'm not going to develop them. There was a long season when the first cathedral burned here that we worshipped it. We worshipped. Now, we worshipped it had the Episcopal service at Temple Emmanuel in Denver. I think about. And we'll get to afterlife in a moment because he and I always talk to afterlife. The best speaker at Grace St. Luke's Episcopal Church and School. I shouldn't say best. Catherine keeps telling me to stop using words like that. The most sought after, packed room, exciting speaker we had every single year in the Easter season was the rabbi. I mean, it was unbelievable. I mean, it was just unbelievable. I mean, so there. Thank God for both academic work that's visionary and experiences that bring us closer together across these divides. Let's shift to all of our hearts are broken and grieving about what is going on across our world. Our hearts are broken and grieving. Certainly, as we think about and pray for the Holy Land, and we would be just humbled, Dr. Gregerman, if you would just share just your perspective in any way that you're comfortable.
Yeah. I mean, this is, of course, both at a macro level, horribly tragic, the conflict that occurs in the Middle East, but also for me personally, I have much of my family lives there. And so I actually got a text this morning that my cousin was just called up as a reservist. Whether that should be put on text to people like me, I'm not, it's like, maybe you want to keep that to yourself. But, those are not auspicious things to hear. And so this affects me quite personally. And I'm really pleased to say I was at Road of Shalom yesterday, the synagogue in Denver, a conservative synagogue, because I arrived on Friday, where the rabbi appropriately spoke about the loss of civilian life on all sides. And in some ways that sounds kind of easy, right? I mean, who doesn't mourn civilian losses? But I'm not sure I hear that as much as I would like to. And it reflects, and by the way, I'm not saying in the Jewish community per se, but I think it's difficult to sort of shake tribal affiliations and strong senses of partisanship. Let me, if I could, let me maybe connect it to something I'm more closely involved with. Certainly in the case of Jewish-Christian relations and dialogue, I'm involved with the Jewish organization that dialogues with the Christian organizations in America, the Catholic and Protestants, and also there's a group that on the international level dialogues with, we dialogue with the World Council of Churches and the Catholic Church. And anyhow, this comes up a lot. And one of the things that has been hard for the Jewish community in these dialogues, and I want to emphasize, going back many years now, though most recently, of course, this has become increasingly salient, is the intense focus on Israel in all of these dialogues and statements that are put out by churches, etc. It's been hard to understand, I think, why this topic has for decades sort of dominated Jewish-Christian relations. Certainly when churches meet, the focus on Israel, and this is again going back decades, is disproportionate out of all, you might say, all measure of anything else happening in the world. The Episcopalian Church met in its last General Assembly, and this happens regularly in all the American church assemblies. Israel got a dozen resolutions, most of them critical. This happens in all the American mainline churches. And it's been extremely difficult for the Jewish community to feel that sense of disproportionate criticism. That is, the way in which to think about Jewish-Christian relations in terms of the current conflict, which is, of course, far worse than has happened in the past, is to see it in a larger context of particularly Jewish-Christian relations, which is what I work on. Now, my point isn't to minimize the seriousness of the conflict, but in the sense that the Jewish community has long felt very much under the microscope on Israel issues, it's been an extremely difficult relationship. General assemblies from all the churches have for years made the Jewish community feel very uncomfortable because the focus is typically on one conflict. 12 resolutions at the Episcopalian General Assembly now, 9 of them at the Presbyterian Assembly. This is a pattern for a long time, and I, in some way, am making kind of a polemical point, but I do think that it's important for the Jewish community's interests to be heard more seriously so that it doesn't always feel like as soon as Christians get together in a room, all they do is talk about Israel and no other problems in the world. And that's not an 11-month problem, that's a decades-long problem. And it therefore has made dialogue around the conflict very difficult.
Yeah, I really appreciate your frankness about that. And a lot of what you're saying resonates.
Yeah. I mean, I don't mean to be overly critical, but I will say that
please.
In our context, I don't mean yours and mine, but in the context in which I'm in, this has been very painful for the Jewish community to feel like it's not been a successful dialogue. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Anything, before we make our last shift, anything more on that topic you would like to tuck in?
So I want to sort of stay in my lane in some way and not opine about politics or history. I'm a scholar of religion. I'm a scholar of Jewish-Christian relations. I'm not inclined to sort of add my 2 cents regarding, for example, ideas of disproportionality or civilian losses, because it's not something that I bring any particular expertise to. The relation between Jews and Christians and how it's affected is something that I care greatly about because it's had enormous promise. But I'm not going to be, I think, so hubristic as to say, well, I don't think how the media reports this or that is a subject that I can get into so much as I can tell you more about sort of Christian theologies of the land of Israel and how those have played out, or Jewish theologies. But I don't think I want to get into the other topic because it's not really something that I have anything more learned to say than perhaps any of you. You know, if you read the paper, you're as learned as I am about those sorts of issues.
None of us in this room believe that, but
I read the paper a lot, but I'm not an expert in it. Yeah.
We'll trust you on that for just momentarily. What I want to shift to, this is where Dr. Gregerman will really espouse his humility and that we're way above his pay grade. So one of the things that, and I've told you this story, not all of you have heard it before, but I said it once in a sermon. So when we would have the rabbi in Memphis, I remember he would say this with some regularity. You know, we were in the Bible Belt. Memphis is the buckle of the Bible Belt. And Rabbi Micah Greenstein we would sometimes get into the subject of, he would bring it up, about resurrection or the afterlife. And he had this line that he would say anywhere, especially sort of in Baptist churches and all over the place. He would say, when it comes to the afterlife, when you discover that I'm there, I don't mind if you're surprised. I just hope you're not disappointed. It was just so spectacular, especially in the Bible Belt. But so we're going to ask Dr. Gregerman to get way above his pay grade here.
Because I said, by the way, I'm not a theologian, particularly working on these topics, but I have some thoughts to share.
So what I want to talk about, so we've got in the spring, after Easter, we're going to do it on the Sunday. Easter next year is Sunday, April the 20th. On the 27th of April, and then on the first Sunday in May, Rabbi Liz Sachs from Temple Emmanuel and I are going to do a 2-week class on resurrection. She and I have done a class together a year or two ago, and it was I found her riveting, just riveting. So I just would love for you to just do a couple of riffs on this. So here's some things that are interesting, that we hear often in the liturgy. My favorite psalm is Psalm 139. I pulled it from the prayer book. It's got this incredible image. Where can I go then from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I climb up to heaven, you are there. If I make the grave my bed, you are there also.
Yeah.
If I take the wings in the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand hold me fast. Yeah. So we will, in liturgy in the Bible, we will often as Christians hear language of Hades, the depths. We're all smart enough to know that sort of at some point the notion of Hades gets mythologized into hell and a kind of place of torment and punishment. We're all smart enough to know that's not exactly what the Bible means by this. Do you mind sharing some of your thoughts
Sure.
on Hades and the underworld?
Yeah. So let me start with a general assumption about this topic, which is if you're talking about eschatology and the end times, you're really talking about now. You're really talking about what you think now, filtered through a discussion about the end of days. Because let's be honest, who knows, right? And so why I emphasize that is because discussions about resurrection, afterlife, tell us something about what it is we think at the present. One of the principles that you find, going back to rabbinic literature, sort of post-biblical Jewish literature, is the righteous of all nations have a share in the world to come. Now, I want to emphasize sort of the two parts of that. The world to come, hold off on that for a moment. But the righteous of all nations is an important, in some sense, corrective to what you might call as a kind of sectarian perspective, namely, we're in and all others are out, right? And when I say sectarian, I'm using that in a rather specific historical sense to say that in the period of the late Second Temple, the early Judaism, the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have a strong sense of boundaries that are defined often theologically. And it reflects a perspective at the time in which one feels embattled. And so what's interesting is that as the tradition develops over time, there is a sort of lowering of a sense of boundaries between insiders and outsiders in a soteriological context, in a salvation context. So the Jewish tradition tends to have a rather capacious view of the world to come and does not expect members of the Jewish community alone or the covenant to be the only ones who are in the covenant, going to make it into what's called Olam Haba, the world to come. Now, I can probably, in the last, 90 seconds I was speaking, say more about the first half of the statement, the righteous of the nations of the world, than I can about the second one, which is the world to come, because there is very little focus on that in mainstream Judaism. The Bible says very little. The passage is about, for example, Sheol, which is this sort of shadowy existence, which God is somehow present, but not really there. There are ideas of that sort in the Bible, but it doesn't really pick up in some forms of Judaism until around the time of Christianity. Now, this is not an exclusively Christian thing, though I will tell you that I am rather struck by, for example, a line, you know the signs they hold up at the football games, John 3:17, 3:16. The end is something like, God loved the world, that he, eternal life. And the focus is on the world to come or the eternal life, as it's the focus, at least in that verse from John, but has been rather prominent in Christianity. And that's another topic, we could talk about it, but I just want to emphasize, Judaism has been much more resistant to speculation of that sort. And it probably reflects something like the intense focus on observance of the covenant, observance of the commandments now. So if you read the Talmud, and it's, you know, sort of encyclopedia length, the focus is really like, what are you supposed to do today? Which is, by the way, not to say no one thinks about tomorrow, but the focus isn't there in quite the same way as it is in other religions. And I don't think there's any distinction between like one's better or one's worth. Like I said, eschatology, what you're really talking about is sort of, what do you care about now? And so what do the rabbis care about? They cared about how you observe the Sabbath, and they have a whole lot to say about that. Almost precludes other topics, you know, in say one section.
I'd love to hear you do just on that, just a very quick riff, and then we'll do
Yeah.
Q&A. But think about one of our most beloved prayers, the Our Father, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, which
Right.
seems awfully in line with exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, so much so that the how do I say, that prayer seems to emerge, not some, so Jesus took it, but the ideas that you find there are regnant in Jewish literature of that time, particularly the sort of intense eschatological hope. And it's connected with, and actually I think what makes that prayer especially beautiful, it's connected with a reversal of what is wrong, right? It's not just make it come because I can't wait to get to heaven, but rather because there's a sense of the world out of joint. And I think that that is, you know, again, in some ways it tells you how the view of the present is expressed in a prayer for the future, in this case in a very sort of beautiful and powerful way.
Well, I as we open it up for questions, let me thank you profusely for really stepping out of your lane. When we were talking about this last question, Dr. Gregerman was like, you've taken this, you know, that's not my area of, the afterlife is not my area of expertise, and nor is it ours, amen? Right. So let's, Q&A, if you'll raise your hand for a question, say your name, your question, and then as you're getting a question, Nancy will start. Go ahead and raise your hand for the second and third question just so we can see you and start moving your way. Speaking of Mike, if you will, for the benefit of those in the room and online.
Hi, good morning. My name's Nancy Stork, and I'm a medievalist. I'm very interested in heresy. And I wonder, you know, the people who come first are never the heretics, but there are countless heretical Christian sects. Christians even said Muslims were heretics. And I'm just wondering at what point the early Jews may have thought of the early Christians as heretics, and at what point did they then say, oh, wait a minute, there's something completely different here?
Yeah. So one of the challenges of knowing what Jews thought in the first 600 years, say, of what becomes Christianity, is that we have almost no Jewish sources. Perhaps the evidence of John gives us a sense of at least what a late first century Jew would have thought was, not sure he's heretical, but problematic. For example, when someone comes around into your synagogue and says, oh, by the way, that guy who was murdered by Rome is the Messiah. And most Jews would have said, well, that's not what we were expecting. You know, worldly change or something happens. And so John is actually good in this regard because he tells us all the things they're fighting over, most of them having to do with Christological statements. The other thing that detracts from a sort of natural Jewish interest in Christianity is that after a few hundred years, Christianity is just another religion. It's just a Gentile religion to which Jews pay almost no attention, certainly until it gets power. And so notions of heresy don't really apply to Judaism vis-a-vis Christianity. There are later ideas, for example, there are Karaites, who are sort of an offshoot of Rabbinic Judaism in the 8th century, who get called, in some sense, outsiders because they don't read the Bible the same way. But notions of heresy are not particularly prominent in Judaism in general, and some of that has to do with power, right? It's one thing to say the Albigensian Crusade is against heretics, and you have an army to make that clear. It's another thing when you're an 8th century rabbi who say, the Karaite Jews are heretics, and I'm going to write that down. And so I think it's caught up with that issue. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is Patrick Walsh. I was wondering, this is a little bit more of a comment that maybe you can comment on. One of the things that I find, like in Jewish and Christian relationships over the years, obviously I will say, outside the last 20, 30, 40 years, I think Christianity just feels very guilty about how it's treated Judaism throughout the years, through thousands of years. But I feel like one of the difficulties within Christianity to Jewishness of Jesus is that we, for so many years, we didn't see the Old Testament the way the Jewish people saw the Old Testament.
Sure.
So we tended to take things such as Genesis and other things as being very literal. And that has really defined so much of Christianity, even up to today when you get to fundamentalism and other areas. It's so very defined and yet so very off.
Right.
And somehow I feel like that connection between Judaism and Christianity through Jesus has gotten screwed up.
Yeah. So thank you. Yeah. So let me maybe two responses. First, this idea of Christians feeling guilty. It's a term. I mean, legit. But I like the idea more of something like a sense of positive responsibility, because no one around did anything. What I do think, and this is certainly something that I find among my Christian colleagues, is a strong sense of commitment to improved relations. And it's, I co-directed an institute with a Catholic, right? These are not acrimony. I mean, these are things that people work together between Christians and Jews of goodwill. And so I like a framing that isn't, I mean, people can feel how they want, but I do think that the context is one of a shared sense of sort of moving forward. The second thing about the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, there's an irony to your question, which is Jews don't really read the Bible. Jews read the Bible through the lens of the Jewish tradition and the rabbinic tradition, and therefore, in some ways, Christians might see the Old Testament and think, oh, that matters to Jews. It does. And I think you're correct in the de-emphasis of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, to Christianity in general, does kind of erase the connection to Judaism. I think that's right. In the 13th century, Christians started calling Jews heretics, and there were attempts to sort of oppress Jews because Christian scholars looked around and said, wait, Jews don't read the Bible. They read the rabbis, and they read the Bible through that. They're not even faithful to their own tradition. Now, there's irony all over that. And your point, by the way, which is the main point you were making, seems entirely correct about the way that sort of Marcionite tendency to sort of deprecate the Hebrew Bible and Christian scripture. I think that's absolutely right. Historically, it's kind of interesting how it plays out. Thank you.
Hi, my name is John Bush. You mentioned toward the beginning about Jesus kind of falling into kind of a genre of apocalyptic Jewish preacher. Yeah. And I've heard it suggested that Jesus actually thought the end times were a lot closer than they really were, like when he said that some of you won't taste death until the second coming.
Right.
So I was wondering what what that end times looked like to Jesus and those other Jewish apocalyptic prophets, and his essential message of like repent for the end is near. Why the emphasis on repentance, and what does that end times look like in relation to that?
Yeah. Uh-huh. See the last one. Uh-huh. You got it. Okay, great. So let me start with apocalypticism, this idea of a kind of dawning of the divine into history or something like that. The first century milieu was extremely unsettled in the land of Israel. It's a Roman colony. It's a time where Roman oppression and Roman sort of heavy-handed leadership is almost too positive. What would you call it? They were, they were ruling like colonizers. Provokes a lot of disappointment and anger and frustration among contemporary Jews in that time. And one of the reasons for that is, and I want you to sort of picture this, you go to the temple in Jerusalem, the holy site where God is in some sense more present. God's out there too. And you bring your sacrifice, and you look up to your, depends where you're standing, you look up to your left, and what do you see? Roman soldiers in a garrison. Something is off. And the image of a kind of rightful leadership, Davidic leadership, and that's you sort of look back to David and sort of rightful kingship, that's very, very appealing and powerful. And so the idea of a reversal to present injustice in whatever form has great purchase on first century Jews, which is why we know of lots of these apocalyptic preachers. As I said, Josephus, the first century historian, must name a dozen of them. And their fate is typically quite bleak. Rome cracks down on anyone who's disruptive. But the appeal at that time seems to be especially strong, especially pitched. And I think that explains Jesus' emphasis and that of others at that time. If you want to know just how intense the sense of injustice and frustration was, well, there was a war that broke out in the year 66 by a bunch of Jews who said, we don't want anything to do with this empire anymore. We want to run our own sacred land. And so that's a very prominent emotion at that time. Was I missing something? I apologize if I forgot the second part. Is that?
No, I think that's outstanding.
Great.
That's outstanding. As we finish, and before I thank you, you've got a public lecture tomorrow night at Iliff School of Theology down by DU. What's the time and the topic?
So the time is when they pick me up. I don't know what the time.
What's the topic?
More extensively on Jesus' Jewishness.
Oh, perfect.
So if you want to hear more, come tomorrow. Although I may repeat myself some. So.
No, well, it would be worth it even to hear that. Truly, thank you. Please join me in thanking Dr. Gregerman. Thanks to everyone joining us online as well. You can come back to sjcathedral.org at 10:30 a.m. for the live stream of Holy Eucharist. God bless you.